And finally, we will discuss animal systems. We've talked a lot about chicken coops and animal pens and using manure for soils and in the garden. Let's talk about animal systems and how they're integrated into a permaculture design. This is a review of an element analysis on a chicken, like we did in class. And just to emphasize the importance it is to do a thorough element analysis, especially on living organisms, they're going to be part of your design, to really understand what they need to thrive and all the things that we get from them to better integrate them spatially into your design so it works really well. And important to know the intrinsic characteristics of that organism too, so we can really, again, be giving them all the things that that animal needs so it's living a good life in addition to it providing for us so we can have a good life too. These are chickens which are free-range chickens. So they're given a big wide open pasture in which to forage for food. They're looking for insects, seeds, some green plant material. This is what part of their intrinsic characteristics. They're genetically predisposed and habituated to roam freely, looking for the types of foods that they are genetically coded to like and look for. And that's where they're the healthiest. We wouldn't want to say happiest, because usually people that say like chickens are happy or not are, considered overly emotional. So we do that with our pets. We think our dogs are happy or sad. But with farm animals, you don't hear that as much. So let's put it in these terms. These chickens are less stressed when they're in this situation than when they're in a small cage and receiving their pre-made food in a little dish. So less stressed farm animals makes what we would call a healthier farm animal, less apt to get diseased or sick, less apt to be in social conflict with their other animals in that pen, and they are more productive. They'll give us more of the things that humans are raising them for. So in a sense, in human terms, they're happier and healthier, as opposed to the next slide. This is a conventional way of eggs and meat are produced. This looks like a meat chicken. I don't even know what you would call it. It's not a chicken coop. It's like a hangar where they're mass produced, put into small areas. They have water and food brought in. They're not foraging, and it's not in a form that they're genetically used to. In other words, like insects and seeds. Some of it might be seeds. But they are given antibiotics for the most part, so they do not get sick because they're in so close of quarters. And sometimes they're even given things to subdue them so they don't fight with each other. In the past, about 15 years ago, it was pretty standard that chickens in a farm like this they had contacts. They would put rows, like red contacts in their eyes, and that would make them be really docile. So these chickens in human terms are not so happy, not so healthy, but they're producing what we want them to, kind of more in the model of slavery. So these animals are being used and not cared for in the way they need to. They're not as productive overall and as the ones that are free ranging. But it takes a whole different paradigm shift, a whole different kind of systemic shift of how we raise animals. And you can watch that YouTube clip at the bottom there. It's part of a movie that partially highlights the way chickens are treated as a metaphor for how humans are becoming there's so many humans that we're kind of being treated the same way in society. Joel Salatin, if you're looking at a picture of him, he is, by his own definition, a Christian libertarian environmentalist capitalist lunatic farmer. He is very innovative, and he's come up with and popularized this pastured poultry idea. And he did it at a large scale. He has a large farm in Virginia, and he was able to, you're seeing a picture of him right there with a big flock of chickens that he puts in this mobile pen that he can move around so they get fresh pasture. Every couple of days he'll move that pen. It's just a electric mobile fence. and they get fresh greens and soil and insects and things that they can forage on. One of the things that he likes to say is we need that building forgiveness into the ecosystem so they can handle the shocks and their resilience in them, and that is the best way for the animals to survive and to live and thrive, and also the healthiest builder of the soil system that all these chickens and pasture depend upon. And it's the most ethical thing to do too, of how to treat these animals as they're raised for food, meat or eggs for humans. Lots of things have been written by Joel Salatin, and we'll talk a little bit more about them next. Just want to introduce you to him. So Joel Salatin, who owns and runs Polyface Farm in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, uses guilds of livestock and so animals and grasses or plants that use and rely on the same set of resources. That's in ecology, that's what a guild is. So it is the group of species that exploit the same resources, or the same resources in different ways. So he's applying this to the agricultural world. Well, Joel Salatin is looking at different types of grasses and animals that will live and help each other out, so to speak. It's very different than overstocking a pasture with animals and then having to feed them from some trucked-in source, or called mob stocking. It's more of a symbiotic grass-animal cycle that's chemical-free. For the example that Joel uses with his cows, they're moved from one pasture to another rather than being centrally fed on corn. So they're free roaming and grazing in a field, and then when that field starts to become depleted, they're moved to a nearby paddock. It's more how naturally, it's more the intrinsic characteristics of these grazing animals to migrate to the better food sources as their food sources run out. They keep moving around. They don't stay in one spot until they eat everything down at the ground, and then the soil biology collapses and the soil becomes compacted. That's how we do it now, and it's not very regenerative or natural or sustainable. Chickens are likewise put into portable coops, sometimes called chicken tractors, because chickens will dig up the soil and scratch and look for grubs and insects and plants, and they will, in a lot of ways, prepare the soil for growing things in. So these chickens are put in portable coops, and they're moved behind the cattle after the cows or cattle have left that site and pooped a lot and left all of the fly larvae have hatched, the maggots, out of the cow dung, and those larvae are really rich in protein for the chickens to eat. So the cattle are brought in, they're grazed for a while, then they start to graze out that little paddock. They're moved on to the next one, then the chickens come in, eat all the maggots and other insects there, kind of sterilizing the field, and so on. They're all moved behind each other, and those two animals now can feed off that same source of food and same piece of land in a sustainable manner. Here's a picture of those poultry chicken tractors, these pens that are moved across the field every few days. You can see they're eating the greens kind of down to the ground, then it's moved on one more step and one more step. And it's not, each little pen or coop isn't in the place so long that it kills the grasses and it kills the soil organisms. It doesn't destroy it. Just after the blades and the basic things have gotten eaten down, the animals are moved on, and then that little plot has enough resources left. The roots are still intact, the root crowns of the plants, they will grow back. These are perennial grass systems for the pastured poultry, and it keeps the grasses and the pasture healthy and rebounding quickly, and the animals get a constant source of food. And this is all after the cattle have left this particular pasture. Joel Salatin's book, called Pastured Poultry Profits, is one that outlines the methods involved in using a chicken tractor, where chickens normally would be kept in a small coop or kept in mobile coops, and they can be moved along the field, not too long at any given location, a few days, After the cattle have been driven out of a field, chickens are brought in these movable pens and they're moved along the field. And the chickens get fresh, green, tender greens and insects for a few days before they're moved on, before they can do really much damage to that little plot of land, and before that plot of land becomes burnt out and overgrazed. To actually be able to do what Joel Salatin does in his book, Pastured Poultry Profits, you'd have to bring it up to date with the cost too. The book was written about 25 years ago. But you'd have to have some startup costs and some input to be able to do his example that uses 6 months on 20 acres with pastured poultry and be able to provide a net income of, or net profit, excuse me, of $25,000. So anyways, whether this exact model does exactly what Joel says, it brings a lot of good points to the surface that if by using these methods that are much more efficient and duplicating efforts, when you're using the same pasture that can raise beef and poultry, they're just temporarily staggered. So you've got the beef coming into that pasture for a few days and then it leaves and the chickens coming after that. And if all these pastures are fenced off and the chickens and the cattle are rotated through that with the cattle on the lead front, these pastures can be used over and over again. They're not used any one time for long enough that the grasses get grazed down so low that they can't rebound within a few days. So this makes costs lower. The amount of time that goes into caring for each chicken, the amount of feed that goes into each chicken or each cow or cattle animal. So it makes the price go down of raising them and your profits go up. And a lot of the food is being produced on site on that pasture through the maggots, the larvae of the flies, or the grass itself. So you have a reduced cost of bringing in food to feed them. Most poultry and beef farms will have to bring in food from other sources, not from local. So that's the reason this whole idea that Joel promotes in his book on pastured poultry profits really can work, because of the much greater efficiency it uses in its methods to raise marketable beef and chicken. And a couple of local examples of people using Joel Salatin's methods. Day Day Farm in Lompoc does to raise organic beef. And San Julian Farm in Lompoc also uses holistic resource management. And that is the method of holistic resource management is a method that even Joel Salatin learned from them too. It's a way to have your cattle or your grazer mimic the natural movements of wild herds that move from one place to another and they never stay at any one place or in any one field or valley too long before they move on to the next source, because these grazing animals are they're genetically adapted to go to the place of the easiest source to get their nutrition, the tender early new shoots in spring, or where water has just come up the sides of a creek, or we've had a rainstorm, where there's really new growth is where the animals go to first. So if you do that and you move the animals around, that's holistic resource management in a nutshell. It was created by a man named Alan Savory. This kind of the idea of using natural herd movements as a way to structure our livestock management. And so San Julian Farm uses that, and in that sense they're able to make things more efficient, sustainable, appropriate, and save money and time and make a better profit. In his book and his videos, Joel describes what he calls his egg mobile. He has a sort of mothership, like the central headquarters of it's like a mobile chicken coop. He has 800 chickens in this system working on sanitizing the pasture, meaning they're eating up all the insects, some of the pathogens, the pest insects, the maggots, and he brings them in 3 days behind the cows, enough time for the fly eggs in the dung of the cows to mature and develop and hatch into a full-fledged larva full of nice fatty proteins. The chickens come in, they eat them all up, and it feeds the chickens, and of course the grasses fed the cows ahead of time. You can produce more biomass pounds of insects on pasture than you can pounds of livestock. So this really makes double use of what's being produced on the land. That's stacking functions that we like to talk about in permaculture. More than one function for each element. And that's how natural systems work. They're very integrated. You get rid of the flies, it's a more sanitized pasture, and this system can produce 40 dozen eggs every day. So with these 800 chickens, so as long as you have a big enough area and you can move them around, this will work. A few more details to this method. As I said before, it's the holistic rotation of animals and crops, and that is this method that comes from holistic resource management from Alan Savory. He has pens that are 10 by 12 foot pens with about 65 birds in each pen, and he moves them one length of that pen each day. So they're on that site for only one day, and then they're moved just that same distance along, so where it's right next to where it was the day before. It's a multi-species guild. So you're talking about some insects, but also perennial grasses and birds and the cows themselves. And Joel doesn't sell outside of a 4-hour drive of his home because he's found that is not profitable. It's not efficient. So he's trying to be efficient in every way that he can. Driving farther than that costs more money than it can make with the production he has on his site. Joel Salatin has a bunch of methods he's come up with, and some of them with these short, catchy little names. This other system, this pig-cow system, is one he developed where he's, again, really using what I would call permaculture ideas of stacking functions and having things be as integrated as possible. The least change for the greatest effect, having the animals do the work for you, like the chickens eating the maggots that help sterilize the field behind the cattle. In this case, he's talking about barn. So over the winter, the cows are inside the barn a lot. It's just too cold and there's nothing for them to eat outside in the pasture. So they're inside a lot. Bedding is added, straw, so they're not standing in their own poop the whole time. And then also feed is brought in. Over the winter, that bedding and dung pile gets added to, and it gets deeper and deeper. And typically, at the end of the spring, they would have to muck out all that stuff from the barn. But in this pig aerator system, once those cows go back out to pasture, he lets the pigs come in and dive in and aerate that entire lot of straw and dung and composted, and he will add fermented corn at the pile here and there as the winter goes by, so those pigs get in there and root it out. And what they do is they're aerating this, and they're helping turn the pile of this green and brown material and get it composting. So in a sense, these pigs are like tractors. They're like farm equipment. Instead of having to work to get all that stuff out of there, the pigs go in there and start the compost process, and this helps the composting of that dung and straw. And just by the pigs turning it, that it starts to decompose, and it can be taken out as fresh compost instead of taken out by hand, all labor of the humans, and turning it and composting it. So he thinks that this model is really efficient. It's helped him a lot in this very laborious task that he normally would have to do, that now the pigs do. Joel Salatin has also developed rabbit systems, systems that can raise a lot of rabbit meat for a very quick turnaround and make good profit. He poses the question in his book on rabbit tractors: you want to turn an acre of grass into $40,000? Well, yeah. He has lots of different details on how you can do that. The great thing about rabbits is most of their food is just off grass in the pasture. You don't have to feed them very much, and they reproduce very quickly. His son, Daniel Salatin, really dove into the rabbit production business, and there's more details on that on the next slide. Let's just talk about rabbits in general for a minute, because rabbits are a great animal for a permaculture system in a number of ways. As far as the outputs go, they produce their fur or their pelts, meat, they produce heat, they produce more rabbits, they produce manure, and they manage waste. kinds of kitchen waste and things they can eat. There's good breeds that for different climates. Our climate, a couple of them that are good for here, Southern California, be the California White and the New Zealand White. Whites are often bred because it's easier to sell their pelts because they can be dyed to different colors more easily. They produce about 6 to 8 rabbits per litter, and they raise, those are pretty good sized litters. So, and they're usually able to keep all those babies alive. So Joel has developed systems using the same thing as a chicken tractor, but it's a rabbit tractor. And another great thing about these is that baby rabbits, bunnies, they nurse off their mother for 8 weeks. So you have 8 weeks, and that these mothers are raising a big part of your herd of all these rabbits, and they're taken care of. So, and they get up to be almost 4 pounds before they've stopped nursing. So that really takes them through the danger zone. I mean, think of that compared to chickens. Chickens, as soon as they're born, they need to be fed by humans. They're not fed by their mothers and cared for like that. So they're a lot more higher maintenance than rabbit systems. Now, admittedly, rabbit meat is not as popular as chicken meat, but it is a good meat source and there is a market for it. So there is some argument to having rabbits on your property or in your permaculture system. They're also really great just like to eat unused green material down and turn it into manure. They're the first start of a compost system that can create better compost for your garden. Some other types of animals to be used in permaculture systems. Of course, these could be used in any kind of, agricultural system, or livestock, but they're talked about a lot in permaculture because people have used these animals in ways that can be integrated and in ways that they have good inputs and outputs of other elements in a permaculture design. Sheep, goats, cows, different kinds of fowl, fish, bees, insects, guinea pigs, frogs, predators can be used to be brought in. Of course, you're not going to be harvesting them for the meat, but they're used for other reasons. Deer too. So as much as you can, look for creative new ways to use those animals in a system where you think about all their outputs and all their inputs and how they can help the system cycle nutrients through the ecosystem and through the humans as part of that ecosystem too. One good movie to watch that came out a few years ago called The Biggest Little Farm is about a farm here in Camarillo, and maybe it's Thousand Oaks, but it's not too far from here. It's called Apricot Lane Farms, and it's a site that they made a movie about, and they clearly had a lot of resources, so they were able to try a lot of these permaculture techniques and work at it. It took 5-7 years for them to get the system dialed in, which is, I think, pretty normal for any kind of permaculture farm. You're going to have to set it up and design it, and then see what works and what doesn't work, and keep tweaking with it. Because what you're aiming for in permaculture is so complex. You're trying to mimic natural systems, and our human brain is not very used to thinking in that kind of complexity of relationships. But we do get better at it as we do it. So it might take a few years, and at this farm it took them a while to really figure out food production, pest management, etc. You can visit there too, if you'd like. This slide is just talking about working with rabbits and giving them a setup where they feel like they can express basically their genetic adaptations as rabbits, what they like to do, what they're built to do. And one of them is to be able to burrow underground, allowing them access to the dirt and the soil so they can dig underground into a hole is really important to them. They're just genetically used to that, so they can go escape the heat or escape predators and feel safe. If you don't give them a place where they feel like they can go inside to a closed, dark space where they feel like that same safety as they do in a burrow, then they're going to be more stressed and less productive and more prone to disease and more work for you. Daniel Salatin has this rabbit tractor that moves them along. It has a slatted bottom. Although they can't dig into the ground, they can access the fresh greens that are growing in a pasture. And normally he would start with 1 buck and 2 does as a ratio and 3 different cages. and they need about 6 to 8 square feet to set that whole area up for a rabbit tractor and for forage. A little more information about the holistic range or resource management method devised by Alan Savory, a Zimbabwean gardener and farmer. He was the one that really started coming up with this idea of mob stocking to mimic native ungulate migration, so hooved animals that moved along and moved from one fresh green growth to another area of fresh green growth. What Alan Savory would do is overstock, like have a lot of animals in a small area, but only keep them for a very short period of time. And Alan Savory came up with this idea because he felt like it was mimicking what, like I've been saying in this lecture, the native hooved animal behavior is you don't have a few animals all dispersed out on this acreage, one over here, one way over there, all just grazing gently on the grass. Usually with the new fresh green growth is patchy. It might be in the low areas where there's water sitting, it might be in the springtime more widespread, but you get all the animals coming and concentrating right around that fresh green growth. That's the mob of animals that you as the farmer creates that with your paddock. So you get them there, but you move them. You physically move them off that spot after 1 or 2 days so it doesn't get degraded. Alan Savory also lived in a drier area of Zimbabwe and developed this method. He noticed that this brittle vegetation, the drier, kind of scrubbier, what we call here like our chaparral, there's something like that there also in Zimbabwe. And in a brittle environment, kind of a drier environment, the vegetation is sparser and it's dispersed over just during the growing season. It's not always growing, and it recovers from being chewed or grazed on slowly or very little at all. In a non-brittle environment, meaning a place where the plants are softer, fleshier, grow faster, there's more green, a wetter area, the vegetation is dense, quick regrowth from disturbance, from being like grazed, and there's a lot of microbes in the soil which decompose the organic matter, dung or leaves and things. So that's the scale that Savory developed, is from brittle to non-brittle. You have a range of vegetation types. And so getting back to where he developed this method in Zimbabwe, in this drier area, again, not so different than our front country here in Santa Barbara. It's more of a desert. There's not a lot of microbes in the soil. It's not a rich, deep, moist topsoil. It's a dry soil. So the microbes, there's some there, but they're inactive most of the year, except in the springtime when we get a lot of water and growth and a lot of organic matter being added to the soil through roots or leaves. He says in a brittle environment where the decomposition is happening, it's not in the soil from the microbes. Excuse me, there's a plane going by outside. It's not in the soil, it's in the guts of the animals that live on that land. So in the desert, you need ungulates, you need hooved animals, deer, antelope, cows, sheep. You need something there to eat the drier vegetation and then decompose it in their gut, and then when they defecate, it comes out partially decomposed and ready to enhance the soil for other plants. In a non-brittle environment, like, you don't need that as much. You could still have grazers and things like that, goats and things that eat that vegetation, but the decomposition is not so focused on happening inside the animal. It happens in the soil more readily. So just a scale he thought about that helped him develop this method, especially for a drier environment. And at Quail Springs, this permaculture farm I've talked about, they have a herd of goats for that one purpose. One of them is to enrich the soils. So the goats can make use of the chaparral and turn it into manure, which can help the soil and help build plants. But also, these goats are necessary for maintaining that exact same system. So all that chaparral out there, which is not very, it's not any good to people, can be turned into something helpful by the goats and can help sustain the chaparral system there, this high desert vegetation. So without those goats or without the sheep or, well, at Quail Springs, it used to be pronghorn antelope that would come up from the Central Valley during the spring and summer to eat all the plants. Without those, which the system is adapted to having those grazers there, that system will start to go into decline. Even the high desert chaparral, the sagebrush and the junipers, they will start to die off because of the lack of the animals on the land that can do the decomposition of the vegetation. So the whole point was we should try to have our systems mimic that. So we get the right grazers on the land and we get them into the densities that system is adapted to. We can raise produce for ourselves, meat, and we can help the land itself. And this is a local example of integrating two different kinds of animals into a human food production system too, if you call wine food. But Clopepe Vineyards in San Ynez has these dwarf sheep and chickens that roam freely. They're free-ranging under the vineyard vines. And these vines are pruned up a little higher than normal, so when the grapes hang down, the sheep still can't get to them, nor can the chickens, but the chickens will sanitize the soil, meaning, and the plants that they can reach, meaning they're getting rid of all the pests. The sheep are able to graze and defecate and add their manure, as the chickens do, to the soil, which helps the vines also. So it's a nice integration of animals and plants into a system that's more like an ecological wild system than our farms normally are. So there you go. Those are some examples of animal systems, and hopefully they're inspiring.